Thank you, Carolyn and Kathleen, and all of you at the library for the important work that you do and for making books available, especially this past year, while following all the CDC guidelines. Extra thanks to Susie Thompson and the program committee, of course, for bringing us a variety of interesting virtual events. Well, it's a privilege for me to be talking with Hayden Herrera about her newest book. It's an unforgettable coming-of-age memoir titled Upper Bohemia, and here is the cover. So, and I want to add also, today is publication date. So special thanks, Hayden, for celebrating here in North Salem. I'd like to give you a little background about Hayden's remarkable career. She is an art historian, critic, and biographer. Her doctoral dissertation about the Mexican artist Frida Kahlo became her first book, titled Frida, a biography of Frida Kahlo. And there's the cover. It was published in 1983 by Harper and Row and was subsequently translated into 13 languages. And there's one of the Mexican edition, the Spanish edition. Her other biographies include Arshil Gorky, His Life and Work, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and Listening to Stone, The Art and Life of Isamu Noguchi, which won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for biography. To pursue her research for her Gorky biography, Hayden was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship. A Japan Foundation grant made it possible for her to travel to Japan to conduct interviews with people who had known Noguchi. Hayden has contributed articles and reviews to several publications. She has lectured widely, taught art history at the School of Visual Arts and at New York University. In addition, she's curated several exhibitions, among them a show of Frida Kahlo's paintings that toured the US museums in 1978, and a traveling centennial exhibition that opened at the Walker Arts Center in Minneapolis in 2008. Hayden earned her BA at Radcliffe and Barnard Colleges and her PhD at the Graduate Center of the City of University of New York. She lives with her husband, Desmond Heath, in New York City and on Cape Cod, and they are both former residents of North Salem. Hayden's memoir, Upper Bohemia, received star reviews, and I thought I'd read just 2 reviews for you. The first is by Daniel Okrent. It says, for a biographer, looking into one's own life can be a risky enterprise. For a biographer as accomplished as Hayden Herrera, it has turned out to be a risk worth taking. Her beautiful, entitled, and rather heedless parents may have failed making households. They had 10 marriages between them. But in the pages of Upper Bohemia, the author has found her way home. Her book is honest, revealing, and deeply felt. And one more review, Sanford Schwartz, possessed of an astonishing total recall, Herrera has given an honest, clear-eyed, moment-by-moment sense of the texture of childhood. I was held by the preciseness of her memories and by her refusal to dress them up. So, Hayden, there are so many things to say about your book, and I thought we would just start with the obvious question, which is, after years of researching and writing biographies, what moved you to turn your lens on your life and write about your childhood?
Yes, well, I just want to say I'm very, very happy to be talking with the library and anybody who loves the library. And thank you, Helen. I had just finished the biography of Isamu Noguchi. It took 8 or 9 years, and I was in my 70s, and I thought, I'm not sure that I can spend another 8 or 9 years. I might not even live that long. So I switched from writing biographies. Also, I really didn't want to spend another 9 years in libraries and archives and taking notes and writing footnotes. I was just tired of all of that. I wanted something much freer in the way of writing, something that, I mean, not that biographies aren't creative, but they have certain demands. And writing a memoir, the idea really started, I wrote it for my children and my grandchildren. I thought that if they knew about my life and my background, they would understand more about themselves, and maybe, and well, the grandchildren would understand their parents better, and maybe my two children, Margot and John, would understand themselves better. So I started out rather modestly, thinking I'll just write whatever I remember. But then as I'm writing along and the pages are, I write on yellow pads and they're piling up, and I'm thinking, I like these stories. These, maybe I want other people to read these stories. So then of course ego comes in, and I thought, I'd like to publish this, and I want everyone to read it, and I want everyone to love it. So it sort of grew out of a very modest idea into something a little bit more important. But yes, did you want to know the difference between
A little
writing?
bit of the difference. And was it difficult to write a memoir? I mean, after the structure of writing biographies was writing a memoir, was it a difficult book to write?
Luckily for me, who I'm not very good at structure, I'm dyslexic, and my mind wanders and it goes into quagmires. And anyway, so they both are chronological, or mostly chronological. You can then, you write it chronologically, and then you can shift things around afterward. So that gave me a given structure, and I felt very secure about that. Both of them are quite visual, especially if you're writing biographies of artists. When I wrote about artists, I always had paintings or sculptures, pictures of those sculptures about which I was writing, on the desk right next to me, and I consulted them all the time. So the visual image was the stimulus really for writing and thinking and feeling. In a way that is true also of memoir, because my memory works in a very, maybe everyone's works this way, but mine works with a sort of, in a very visual way. I remember how things look. It flashes through my mind maybe how my older sister Blair looked in the pond, or how my father looked when he was making drinks at his little bar, or how my mother looked when she was driving a car. Things like that. They just flash into your head, and then as you're writing, you expand slowly. Your memory gets bigger, it grows. And so anyway, those two, the fact that they're both very visual, I think was helpful to me. Yes.
Did you keep diaries? I know at one point when you're in Mexico, your mother produces a diary for a border guard. And I wondered, did you keep a lot of diaries, or how did that work?
You know, I'd be given one of those little diaries that lock at Christmas, and I'd write, today I had ice cream or something. Really. They were ridiculous, my diaries. And I don't know where that diary is, but it did prove, well, you have to, if you live in Mexico, you have to go to the border every 6 months. And we went, and then we couldn't get back into Mexico because they said we didn't live there, but the diary proved that we did live there. Later in life, I did keep diaries as an adolescent, and yeah, but not as a child, really.
You know, one thing when you are writing a memoir, before we look at some of the pages in the book, it often seems as though two people are there at once. You have yourself, the writing self, and then you have to slip under the present to find the past. And you've found that voice of the child, though it's an adult writing. I mean, that's sort of film magic to me. How you've done that, I think is just extraordinary. The late poet Tom Lux used to say that every poem needs an on-ramp and an off-ramp, and that holds true with a memoir as well. And your book is so beautifully laid out, and you begin with a preface in which you as an adult are writing about your parents and your vision or your view of them and your extraordinary family background. And then there's that wonderful one-page passage view from the porch, in which it's almost like an invocation to memory to come back to you, and it does. And I wonder if you could read the first 4 paragraphs from the preface to give everyone an idea of your writing style and also the family background, which is amazing.
Yes. So the preface. This is, our mother was a terrible mother, wasn't she? My older sister and I share a rueful laugh. Part of each of us wants to say, no, she was wonderful. After a pause to search through memory, one of us nods. Yes, she was a terrible mother, but our terrible mother gave Blair and me a wonderful life. And she was not the only terrible mother. Most of our friends had terrible mothers too. When we talk with them about our childhood these days still, we compare about whose mother was the worst. It's competition to have the worst mother. And this is very consoling. Our mother's terribleness becomes a joke. It's not fair. Our fathers are off the hook. For all his charm and wit, Blair's and mine was an absent father. For all, yes, and as one of his wives observed, your father never lost a night's sleep over anybody. In addition to their numerous love affairs, my father and mother were each married 5 times. They believed in the importance of pleasure, of living life to the hilt. They believed in the importance of following their own desire. That was really for them a moral imperative. Repression, sacrifice, and compromise were cowardly. What our parents desired was not always in the best interests of their children. If they fell in love and had to pursue a new lover, they did not hesitate to stash Blair and me with some friend, relative, or boarding school. Children were secondary to the leading of a passionate life. What I want to understand is how could our mother have behaved the way she did? And maybe that's why I wrote this book. What made the parents of our friends be so impervious to their children's needs? Why did our father think it was acceptable to live in another country and to turn up now and then with a different wife? And why, if they ignored us, were Blair and I so captivated by our parents? Our mother called her friends Upper Bohemians. Most were artists or writers or architects living in either Manhattan or the Outer Cape, which to me is Wellfleet, Truro, and Provincetown. And most of them were born between 1908, the year of my parents' birth, and 1920. These so-called Upper Bohemians had privileged childhoods, but rebelled against their parents' way of life. They rejected convention and insisted upon personal liberty. Their lives were full of adventure and drama mixed with chaos. The flush of excitement that came with a new love affair made a marriage worn down by progeny seem dull. The sense of security and continuity of duty fulfilled that might have come from sticking with a spouse for the sake of the children was not enough to hold them back from the thrill of the unknown. There's one more little paragraph that you wanted me to read, Helen, which is
background.
Because they were born into a world of privilege and they belonged to what my mother called good families, meaning upper class, they had the gift of confidence. My parents did not have to earn confidence by achievement. Self-esteem was bestowed upon them by birth. My father, John C. Phillips, his first American ancestor was the Reverend George Phillips. He was educated at Cambridge University in England and came to this country in 1630 aboard the Arbella, which was the flagship of the Winthrop fleet. His descendants founded Phillips Exeter and Phillips Andover academies. I should also mention that Wendell Phillips was a direct ancestor, and he was a very renowned abolitionist and a great orator.
Mhm.
Has a statue in the Boston Common.
Yeah.
Okay, my mother, born Elizabeth Cornell Blair, couldn't have cared less about her forebears, but she did once tell me that she probably had Native American blood and that she was related to King John the Bad. When she had an exhibition of her paintings in Mexico City in 1949, she told a newspaper reporter that she was descended from John Paul Jones, who was a Scottish-born naval officer who, after killing two subordinate seamen in two separate incidents of rage, had to flee, and he joined the Continental Navy, became a hero of the American Revolution. That my mother's great-grandfather, Ezra Cornell, founded Cornell University did not seem important enough for her to tell me. Her more class-conscious younger sister made sure that Blair and I knew. So
I find that so interesting that on both sides of the family, the academies, Phillips Exeter and Phillips Andover, are premier prep schools in the country, and Cornell University, of course, is one of the great Ivy League schools. Really remarkable. I have a few slides which I can see if we can show those. It may take 2 tries. We'll see how this works. Sorry, I think I have to go back. Let me try one more time. Okay. I'm going to share screen, basic. And then present. Here we go. I'll slide down. Sometimes they jump pretty rapidly, but if you want to say a few words about your parents.
This is my mother and father in the Caribbean. They were not married yet, but they had met, and my father had to divorce another woman, and my mother divorced her first husband, and they fell in love, and they spent the next years living in Cape Cod. So that's when they were pretty young.
Here's another.
My mother, that's obviously somewhat later. I'd say she was in her probably 30 by then, at that time. She was extremely conscious of her beauty. She always told me I was a great beauty. So beauty was a huge thing in her life. Neither of her children quite measured up, I think, in her mind. Anyway, it wasn't just her own beauty that gave her easy access to friends. I mean, she walked around Cape Cod, went to parties without any clothes on because she had a beautiful body as well as a beautiful face. And in a way, her beauty probably cut her off from a lot of realities in life. She was quite narcissistic. But also she was totally involved with beauty of nature, and she was a painter, a good painter, I think. So she was kind of obsessed with beauty. That was the most important thing in the world.
Yes, and in your memoir, you mentioned on a couple of occasions, I watched my mother's face. She saw beauty everywhere. I tried to see it too, but all I saw was land stretching into the distance. And for her, everything, she was constantly in pursuit of the beautiful. And there's your mother again.
There she is on the beach, so-called Phillips Beach in Cape Cod. This would probably be about 1939, I think. I know my sister was born when this was taken. You can see she's not wearing clothes, and she has a little dog that she's hugging. She, besides loving her own beauty, she also loved sun and water. She was an extremely sensuous woman, took great pleasure in sun and, everything to do with nature.
Yeah.
This is a photograph of my mother and father in what we call the big house on one end of this pond, a kettle pond in Truro called Horseleech Pond. And that's me. I'm just born there. And my older sister Blair looking at me a little bit I think, with misgivings. Anyway, yeah. And then, okay, that's probably enough of that one.
It's a wonderful, wonderful picture. Yes, the older sister realizing she has competition.
Yes.
There's a new baby. And that's
So
you.
that was taken by a photographer called Hans Namath, and it was taken when I was 5 years old. By this time, my mother had, when I was not quite 3, she left my father and she took Blair and me to live with her in New York. This, I think, was taken on some beach near New York City. Anyway, I was, life was not that easy, but I was a pretty happy child. And I don't know, I was rather maybe tough, could deal with adversity.
Let's go down.
My grandmother. This is my father's mother, Eleanor Hyde Phillips. Her father started the Bath Iron Works in Maine, and he was actually the youngest general in the North Side in the Civil War. And anyway, Gaga, she was called Gaga by all of her grandchildren, and she was wonderful. I've lived with her. Blair and I lived with her in the end of 1949, and for 6 months she took us, because both the parents were expatriates. My mother was in Mexico, my father was in Europe, and so we ended up living with Gaga, which was fantastic. She lived in Garden Street in Cambridge, Mass, and she had very good manners. She taught us manners. We were probably barbaric when she took us in. Taught us things like, where to put your fork and how to put it on your plate afterward. And we adored her. She sent us off to Buckingham School. She loved us. I don't know how she managed, really, because it's a big job taking care of a couple of sad little children for 6 months.
She called you affectionately her 2 pet elephants, which was just so touching and adorable. And
well, we did eat a lot, I'm afraid. And we were both a little bit overweight. Yeah, we were her elephants. Yeah.
And one other thing about her, you mentioned also that she had the dimple in the side of her face, the same as your father, and had your father's charm. I mean, your father had her charm, that she charmed people and had formal teas in the house, where she wore long velvet tea gowns, and distinguished people from Harvard would come over for tea, and the cook would make special pastries for you. All right, so then we go down here a little.
So is there an animal here on my television? No, it's okay. This is a rowboat on Horseleech Pond on the beach, the swimming area, just under the big house, which was where Blair and I lived until 1943, when our parents separated, and that was when my mother took us to New York. But we still came back to Cape Cod every summer, so it wasn't that we were losing Cape Cod completely. Anyway, Blair is looking very nice towards me there. So she actually became the most important person in a way in my life, because she was the one permanent person. And I relied on her. I kind of worshipped her. But I think sometimes I was a bit of a drag for her, because she had to look after me a lot.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yes, you've commented that you admired her so much, and you felt she was better at you at everything, whether it's roller skating, and she was fearless, sort of like her mother. I mean, it seemed to be fearless and very strong.
The photograph on the right. Oh,
sorry. Yes, there we are, New York.
We were now living in New York. I guess I'm about 3, and Blair was 3.5 years older. And my father would come occasionally and pick us up and take us to Central Park with his wonderful dog, Hamlet. So yeah, it's not as though we never saw him until eventually in 1948 he left the United States and went to live in Europe. So then we didn't see him as much. But Cape Cod was always the place where we got to see him. So
Whoops, sorry. And there you are again in New York, I guess.
This is the same. This is a little bit later. This is probably 2 years later than the other one. It's again Central Park, and I'm sure my father took this also. He took a bunch. He was a very good photographer. And then this was the middle one is again New York. I think I must be 2.5 there, and it's a professional. My mother took us to a professional photographer. They're very funny. We're plump already. And then over on the right is a picture of me at Hickory Ridge School. My mother in 1948 left her alcoholic, abusive husband that she had actually left my father for, and she was with him for 5 years. Then she ran away to Mexico to get her divorce, and she put Blair and me on a night train to Vermont to go to this school, Hickory Ridge. And that's me looking a little bit forlorn, although I had a pretty good time most of the time at that school. My mother, gorgeous. I mean, she looks a little, she's sort of like Greta Garbo or Marlene Dietrich. There was a sort of look that women had at that time, kind of cool, hard to get look, a little bit icy. Anyway, that's her looking.
And you talked about her at one point of being the ice queen, and men, just adored her. And she was in a way aloof, a bit aloof. And I was thinking of the Russian poet Joseph Brodsky used to say, one of the definitions of the beautiful is something that isn't yours. Mm-hmm. And so the fact they couldn't have her perhaps added to her allure and beauty.
She had a tremendous allure. The next one.
Sorry, there's your father.
So this is Lobster Lake, one of the two cabins. There's two main cabins, and that's my father in 1949. He picked up Blair and me from Cape Cod, and the cover of the book is us on the way to Lobster Lake. And my father would have been driving. Anyway, there he is. I guess we just arrived at Lobster Lake because he's carrying a suitcase and a blanket. He was very
very handsome man. I mean, you can see his charm.
He was fun. Actually, it's not very important, but at that point, I think there's a Band-Aid on his left wrist, and he had a boil. And he was not totally happy at that point because in 1948, he fell in love with Magooch, who had the widow of Arshil Gorky. And Gorky killed himself in July, and in August, my father met Magooch at a dancing party, and then in September or October of that year, he came to one of his houses in Cape Cod and found Magooch dancing with Roberto Mata Echauren, the Surrealist painter, and they courted my mother. They both courted Magooch, and I think my father won out more or less because he went to live with her in Italy in 1948. But he came back, and he wasn't so happy at this trip because Magooch was still seeing Mata. And anyway, that's just part of the story.
Little aside, the complications of their love affairs and marriage. And this is a picture of the pond. And I thought this one page that you might read from that before you dive into the past. It's called View from the Porch, 2017. This absolutely beautiful pond that was so important in your life. And I'll leave it to you to read, if you would read that or tell us about the pond and then read that selection.
I'll tell you a little about the pond. The big house was at the other end of the pond, the far end on the left. In 1942, my father raised turkeys as part of the war effort, and he got sick of doing that. And anyway, they were eaten by owls. Yeah. And so in 1945 or 6, he moved all of the turkey brooder houses to this end of the pond where you're standing right now looking at this pond. And he lined them up on the shore, and they became our bedrooms. They're 5 little turkey brooder houses made of homicide, which is sort of like cardboard. Anyway, and then he built a bigger house and a fantastic porch, which is everybody's favorite place in the world. So this is the view from the porch of this turkey. We call it the turkey houses. It's the turkey house porch, and there's what you see. And that pond has a great deal to do with memory for me. In fact, it's the only consistent thing that was always there and could be relied upon not to go away. So, view from the porch. The wind picks up. I sit at our porch table and watch waves of light pass through lily pads and pickerel weeds as they move toward the pond's shore. One after another, the ripples touch the water's edge and sink into the deep like memories not set down. Imagining the pond's depths, alive with swaying lily pad stems, I can follow the strands of time back to the beginning. The pond water is the fluid of my birth. Every time I walk into it, I am born. If I stare at it, everything that happened, or most of it, will rise to the surface.
I love that passage because it is like an invocation to the pond to give you those memories. And as we know, to find those memories are down underneath, often not visible on the outside of who we are. And here's a wonderful picture of you also on that same page, fastening your hair with that strong back, ready to dive in and find those memories. And it reminds me also that through your book, I have this strong feeling of strength, not of complaining or misery about some circumstances that sometimes were just really heartbreaking, but of strength as you come out at the end. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about, I'll go off this full screen for a moment. If you could tell us a little bit about the various places you lived, and then perhaps Mexico. We have enough time left. If you could read a little bit from the Costa Mama to give a clear picture of the setting and those sparkling details and how your mother saw beauty everywhere. I think that's page 144.
You want me to read that now or talk a little about all the different?
Maybe talk a little bit about the various locations, and then, yeah.
Started out in Cape Cod, and that ended around 2.5 or 3, but it didn't really end because every summer that we were there. And we lived in New York until 1948. Then we went to that boarding school in Vermont. That was for a year. And then, God, everything kept changing. Then my mother left Blair and me in Cape Cod again with a couple that took care of us, but that didn't work. So she sent us to live in Cambridge, Mass, with our grandmother. There were a lot of custody struggles between my father and mother, and eventually my mother always won. But in 1950, the Coche de Mama part is when she turns up. We hadn't been to Mexico. She'd gone off to Mexico in 1948. We didn't see much of her until 1950, when I can read you the Coche de Mama. She turns up and surprises us because we hadn't seen her in a while, and takes us to Mexico. Do you want me to read that now?
Yes, please. Just a couple of paragraphs from that would be wonderful.
Okay, and just tell me when it's too much.
Okay.
Every year, autumn announces itself too early. It starts out, by the way, on the pond. In mid-August, a few branches of the tupelo trees along the pond's edge turn red, and the tops and bottoms of the reeds lining the shore become yellow. Seeing that red and yellow fills me with dread. Crows flap from tree to tree. First they go caw, 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 and then they make 4 caws. And finally, a steady caw noise reverberates in the forest like a chainsaw. The squawks foretell winter darkness and loss. With summer over, Blair and I always have to leave our pond. This means leaving either our mother or our father or both. One morning, do you have the photograph of my mother in the car?
Yes. No, that one I don't have. Yeah.
Okay, one morning when our father had gone to Orleans to buy something for one of his houses, my mother turned up at the bottom of the turkey house driveway. When she opened her car door, she looked angry. Maybe she was always angry when she was tense. After kissing Blair and me, she stepped back to give us her appraising look to see if we were fatter, or thinner, or prettier, or uglier. Then she announced that she had a new secondhand station wagon. This is the coche de mama, she said. We are going to Mexico. The car was a huge Chrysler with real wood paneling on the outside. In the back, she had packed her belongings, her paints, her folding easel, and a duffel bag with clothes. All of this was covered with a mattress that Blair and I sat on the mattress the whole trip to Mexico and actually slept there at night as well. She reached into the front seat and handed us each a little wooden lacquer-covered box hinged at the back like a sailor's trunk. Mine was black, decorated with blue and pink flowers. Blair's was red, decorated with exotic birds. We would take these with us, our mother said. In Mexico, you can buy silver jewelry for almost nothing. These can be your jewelry boxes, she told us. My mother always made everything sound wonderful. The future was always sounding great, and we were pretty convinced that she was right. She was like sunshine. Blair and I moved toward her like two Icaruses, but we never touched her golden rays. Now I could go on, but maybe we don't have time.
We have about 5 minutes left. One thing that there is this really lovely passage at the bottom of 144, that sentence, you're back at the turkey houses, your mother is packing up the car, and you make that comment, you realize you have to leave, get in the car, and you say, I wished I could hug the pond.
Mm.
And once you took a jar of pond water with you, but had to finally throw it out. And just a couple of more things about the pond, and then we can wind things up a little bit. But on 224, there is this, I think it's that 224, that you love the pond so much. Perhaps that's not the right page, but you said that you felt as though you loved the pond more than you loved your mother and father. And
well, the pond was reliable. It was ours and it didn't change. It didn't make us go to 12 different schools before we even, finished high school. It was just always there, and it was wonderfully horizontal and calming. It's something about a horizontal line that is very reassuring. And also for me, my memory, I think of memory as sort of settling down and sort of sinking into the pond. And it is a sinking in. Anyway, the pond is the best thing in my life.
oh,
Aside
wonderful.
from various people, I love very much.
That is wonderful. And I thought of that well-known phrase of Lauren Isley, which he says, if there is magic on this planet, it is contained in water.
Mhm.
And certainly you feel that when you are immersed in the water and you feel whole, and the pond embraces you. And as you say, it is there all the time. And either your mother or your father are with you at the time. We're running short on time, and I wonder if you could just say one last word about you and Blair today, because this extraordinary friendship and that you have with your sister, and where you live and where you spend your summers.
Yeah, it developed over the years. There were periods where I was very jealous of Blair because she was so beautiful. And I was probably a pain in the ass to the little sister, how annoying. But over the years, and then of course we share the turkey houses, we share that pond. So there are always little territorial issues. But in the last years, we've become closer and closer, which is wonderful. And in fact, Blair and I live in the same building in New York City. We both, and Riverside, and we both look out at the same river. And we both because we're so attached to the pond that when the other sister had to have her month, it was always a terrible thing. You'd have to leave the pond. So we each ended up with a house in North Truro. And so we have a place to go. So you're not completely separated from Cape Cod.
Yeah. And you talked about owning houses and building a house gave you that feeling of security and order, and no one could take it away from you. And at one point, as you're a little older, as you're approaching 13 in the memoir, you really are tired of being taken around by your mother from one place to another. And you said, I no longer wanted to live in smithereens, and you wanted that structure of your father's. Your father was with Magoosh and had children. And anyway, I highly recommend this book, the memoir, Upper Bohemia. And today, again, is publication date. And you learn so much. W.H. Auden used to say that you don't read a book, you are read by a book. So as one reads a memoir, you begin to feel your own life coming back and find things that are similar or dissimilar, or you learn a lot reading a memoir. And I'm so glad you wrote this book, and I hope you will write a follow-up. In fact, 2 follow-ups for this.
Well, Helen, I'm so glad you read it so well.
I love it. It's really the poetic lines that run throughout, the visual details. They animate the scenes always. And then those touching moments when you're feeling heartbreak and your heart does that crunch up thing so that you can survive. And other moments your heart just swells with gratitude that your mother has come back. And I just find all of that just deeply moving. So congratulations.
Thank you.
We might have some questions. I don't know if we have any questions. I'll leave it to Carolyn and Kathleen. Whoops.